only a transition to a different sphere of consciousness. Caroline is not like those she's with. She is a living presence in their spiritual earthbound plane.
Hello and welcome to episode 44 of the Talking to the Dead podcast. This week, as you would have heard last week, I have every intention of contacting people from the Roman era of Cologne. Now, I had intended to spend most of the episode in the Romanish museum in Cologne, which is right next to the Cologne Cathedral. However, this is what happened when I got there. Well, that's a little bit disappointing. I just got here on my bicycle to the Romish Germanische Museum, and the whole place is closed. It sits here right next to the Cologne Dome, and it's currently being completely ripped apart. And as I look through the entrance here, I can see the most amazing looking fresco on the floor, which obviously they're not touching the Roman stuff, and I can see just nothing but a big building site. So obviously we're going to have to leave visiting the Romans to another day, but for now I think it's best I go and have a look at one of the Roman things just opposite the church. Well, not a complete waste of time. I'm sitting here, standing underneath the Cologne Cathedral, because there's a kind of innocuous entrance which leads to a car park, but it also leads to people who want to go to the top of the Dome Cathedral, which I certainly won't be doing with my knees. But underneath here, I'm in the basement of the cathedral. I can see the original 15th century foundations. Very, very solid. You can see why it survived the war. Made from all sorts of Roman remains and bricks and everything that was Roman, and probably before that, have been used as the foundations to build the cathedral on. So it's extremely solid. And also there are the remains of a cellar of a Roman villa that they found right next to the cathedral here when they were excavating and doing archaeological digs for the cathedral. So it's quite interesting. It was very nice to see that, and to imagine people putting all their food and all the things that they wish to keep cool in the cellar. And it said that obviously only the rich people could have a cellar, I suppose pretty much like now, and they could keep all their possessions that they wanted to keep cool and safe in the cellar. So yeah, now I'm standing in ancient Colonia, and this in front of me is an archway, probably leading into the museum, and it's definitely Roman times down here, and I get a tremendous sense of that and that age and that history. All you can really see now, of course, with Roman remains are the foundations, because all the buildings above over the centuries have been knocked down, and all the rocks and all the stuff, all the building materials were reused to build houses above, and that's obviously gone on centuries after centuries. So that's why when you stand above a Roman ruin, you look down, because you're looking at just the foundations, the solid foundations, and you can see why they couldn't remove those, really, because they're just, with Roman concrete, just impenetrable, and they survived if you dig down to find them. And then on top you just have the stratas of history going from 1250 to 1350 to 1520 when they were building this cathedral, and all the layers have just grown meters and meters above the foundations of Rome, which gives that impression that it's below. So there you are. That was a bit of a surprise. I certainly wasn't expecting for it all to be closed down, but hopefully I can go back there one day when everything's opened up. But no matter, because I did get the chance to walk around the basement of the cathedral. I also touched it and I felt the energy there. I managed to really get a sense of some things. And also a couple of things happened last night in my dreams, which I think probably an indication of things that will happen later on in this episode. So, I'll tell you about those first. And then I will ask Titan if he'll come in, and let's see if Titan can bring any Romans or explain to me what I've been feeling and what's going on in the Roman world right now. The images that I had last night was that I was invited to some huge banquet, it would seem, or some meeting, and I'm not terribly sure it was set in Roman times. But most definitely it was an organization of people meeting. And I got that sense that I was part of that organization in some form. However, when I got there, I and a lot of the other people with me were just kept waiting around. We weren't given any breakfast, I remember thinking. And then that turned into lunch, and no lunch at all. And I began to think, this is extremely rude. What on earth are we here for if we're not actually going to be talked to? And then it turned in towards dinner, and I began then to feel this isn't right at all. And I think a lot of the people around me were also getting incredibly agitated. So I just remember trying to break away from where I was. And there were definitely guards there keeping us in this particular part of this big area. And they were following me as I was running, and I was running, and eventually managed to sort of make my way behind curtains and walls to the area where obviously the more elite people were having beautiful food, and they had this wonderful sort of dining room type of thing, and they were eating food and drinking drink, and they all looked at me as if they knew who I was, but obviously very surprised to see me there. And I remember having this really, really strong feeling of injustice, and the sense that I was being somehow excluded from this group. And I was wondering exactly what that meant. That was really the big dream. So when I come back in a few moments for me, and probably almost instantly for you, hopefully Titan will be here, and he can explain to me what that's all about, and maybe help me meet some Romans. Okay, so Titan is here. Titan, hello, thank you for coming. Perhaps you could give me an indication as to, first of all, what was that dream about, and what was happening to me? Titan says that there's a man wanting to come through. He is from Roman times, and he can probably explain better to me exactly what was happening, because it was him, and he's saying it, and he was you. Oh, here we go again. So another past life. Is that normal? And she's saying, yes, it's probably an awful lot easier for you to contact past lives than it is to actually contact people so long ago whose energy is massively depleted and almost extinct. Okay, so can you explain that a bit more? Yes, she says that with the energy that's left behind by a person or an object, unless there's a tremendous amount of energy and a tremendous sense of something that's left behind, that's either because people still want it or because of the gravity of what had happened at that particular place, that energy does start to dissipate, and after hundreds and hundreds of years, in the case of the Roman Empire, there really is very little left in terms of energy that you can pick up. However, that certainly doesn't stop you from being able to contact things inside your soul. And in your particular soul, you were a number of different things, and one of them happens to have been a Roman, and a Roman in Cologne. And he will come through now, and I will tell you what he says. Okay, so he says hello. He says that it's really interesting that he gets the chance as a previous part, or if you want to see it that way, as a present part or a future part of you and your soul but the part that obviously is coming through now was to you in the past, thousands of years ago, in the old city that was originally called Colonia Agrippina, and it was founded, I think about 50 or 60 years after the birth of Christ. So tell me, now I've got you here, tell me a little bit about what happened to you in that dream that I was having. He said that he obviously had to frame that memory in something that was a little bit more accessible to me, because for me to actually have been in a Roman environment in those days would have probably been quite a shock to me, because it would have been hard for me to really envisage it. He said it was a mile away from what you saw in movies about Rome. Things weren't really that much like that at all. Obviously, all the movies you see are Western interpretations of something that happened in a culture and in a people and a way of thinking, and that is so vastly different from your own. And that the sensibilities and the manners and the laws were very different. The attitude, he says, the attitude towards life, towards property, towards people was completely different. There was nothing much thought of making a certain person a slave, or another person a citizen, another person a senator, another person a leader or a god. There was a strata in society, and you were very much in your own strata, either through birth or through conquest. And you could also earn citizenship, for instance, by being in the military, or by being given freedom by the person who owned you as a slave. And he said this is where he comes in, because he says Cologne at the particular period that he was there was very much a military place. It was a military garrison. And the dream that I had was his memory, that he thought it would be interesting to share. He was a person who had been in the military and was a free citizen of Rome, but also free citizen of Colonia, which was a very important part of the Roman Empire, and made up most of what was called, I think, Germania. He tells me that yes, at this particular time when he was there, mainly what was happening in Cologne was soldiers, and various legions were based there. Most of what the Roman Empire was doing was spreading out and taking over by force all sorts of areas that are now known as France and Germany. Obviously, even Israel, where the story of Christ comes from. And he was stationed in the Cologne barracks. He was invited there with a bunch of other people because there was a tremendous amount of discontent. It was a particular period where Rome was very much distracted by what was going on in things near Rome, and huge amounts of the troops were taken away, he says, and there was going to be almost a civil war back in Rome over the future of the leadership of the Roman Empire. So an awful lot of troops with the head of the garrison here in Cologne went down there, leaving the garrison actually quite undermanned. And at the same time, there were a lot of the local people, the people who had been captured and basically overtaken by the Romans, who were left behind, who weren't completely Romanized. And there was this very strong movement to try and take that opportunity to overthrow the Romans in Colonia. And he was invited to this meeting as a senior member of the garrison, and he was being asked essentially to attend, to have a meeting to discuss in the end whether it would be possible for the remaining army to turn against the Roman Empire and join the local tribes who were there to take back their city and their area and make the most of the time while the Romans were gone. So he said he was invited there very much on those pretenses. However, when he got there, he really had a very bad feeling because he could see how these people who were going to lead this rebellion were somehow marginalizing him and his compatriots. And he was extraordinarily unhappy, and he began to have second thoughts, as they all did, especially when he saw what potentially would happen if these tribes would end up replacing the Romans. In many respects, they were so much worse than the Roman hierarchy. They were basically making the most of the time while the Romans had gone, and they were drinking all the drink and eating all the food and lording it up, he said, to such an extent that it was very difficult for the people of Rome to actually enjoy their lives and have enough food. And already you could see a new hierarchy being created. He said it was at this time that although we all knew each other, the distrust took place, and as a result, he said he decided not to join this rebellion, and neither did his colleagues, and they decided to remain loyal in their military capacity to the Roman Empire. And as history will say, that particular rebellion pretty much fizzled out. He says that the reason he wanted to show me this was part of a brief description that he would like to make about the way the Roman Empire was, and draw some parallels, he says, as he is part of me, to matters that are happening right now in the world. He says that he wants to again tell me the truth as to what it was like in those times as a member of the Roman Empire, but originally somebody who had been subsumed into the Roman Empire, and he'd managed to rise through the ranks of the armies and eventually gained his own freedom and became a Roman citizen. But he said not everyone in the army had yet become Roman citizens. You needed to have done it for a period of time. He's saying maybe 20 years or so in order to do that. But he said the whole structure of Roman society was extremely unfair in the respect that so many of the people, particularly out of Rome in the conquered lands, were obviously the conquered people, and they generally had very little rights. And there was always discontent in all of these far-flung reaches of the Roman Empire because when the Romans came, they were extremely cruel. And again, whatever history has told you about it being a peaceful regime for a lot of the time, it was far from that. There were always rebellions. There were always people who were deeply dissatisfied at the injustice between the different stratas of society. They hated the fact that whenever the Romans came to take over a place, they immediately needed to fund all their campaigns, their military campaigns, but also they needed to fund the development of what they were doing in that country, which in itself wasn't so bad. But also they would tax beyond belief all the local merchants for a whole bunch of things. He said there were so many different sorts of taxes that had to be paid. And this would almost make everybody else poor. He said he could almost imagine that sort of 95% of people in the Roman Empire were poor, very poor, and some of them didn't really know when their next food was coming. And the remaining sort of 5% were very much the elite and the wealthy. And they were seen by the vast majority of people as completely out of touch and basically living off everybody else. And it was considered to be massively unfair and unjust. He says the correlation between that and the world you live in now is very stark. He said that if you think about what had happened to the Roman Empire throughout Egypt, throughout those parts of what are now Arabia, or through France and through Germany, through England, this massive empire. It was all controlled centrally from Rome by a despotic ruler who, over a period of time, started almost considering themselves to be religious gods. And they were, although there was a Senate which was trying to, in a sort of democratic way, hold them to account on behalf of the people, it was all extremely corrupt. So many of the senators were corrupt. The leaders were corrupt. They would do anything for money. Money was really what drove the Roman Empire. And he says that it was well known that the lady who was born in Cologne, who was very much revered in Cologne still, Agrippina, she was a very historical figure here, and she was highly connected to the Roman Empire through marriage and through her brother, he says, and also she was born here in Colonia. But she was extremely corrupt and extremely vicious, and she only had one thing that she wanted, which was money. And with money, she felt, came power, and with power came everything. So that is what he says you will find in your world now. The parallels to the Roman Empire and what are happening in world history at the moment are identical. You have these elites with huge amounts of money. You have masses amount of poor who are envious of that and feel that they're not getting what they justly deserve. And you've got wars constantly keeping people very busy. You've got the sense that that more and more leaders are wishing to conquer more and more land in your world at the moment and expand their borders beyond where they currently are. And in that respect, you'll find that the people who are conquered are going to feel more and more disadvantaged and resentful of the fact that they don't have a life that's equivalent to the people who are conquering them. They won't enjoy the same privileges of citizenship or rights. He says, ultimately, the Roman Empire will fail, and it'll completely destroy itself from within. There will be so many warring factions within, so many dissatisfied people, so much corruption, so many factions fighting against each other for power, that eventually Rome will be so distracted by all these machinations that they will completely take their eye off the ball and allow other peoples to take advantage of that and eventually destroy the Roman Empire and retake the lands that the Romans had conquered for hundreds of years. So in a way, he's saying that he's an example of this happening in Cologne. It was one of the very first places that the real dissatisfaction became known. But for that experience where he and his compatriots saw the true face of the people who were planning to usurp Roman rule, that saved Rome and gave it a few more breaths of life while we remained loyal to the Roman Empire, because the alternative was worse. He said that ultimately he died in Colonia, and there was a significant period of peace, as much as it could be, but there was always a simmering resentment for the way that the Roman authorities would tax and take everything they could possibly take from the areas that they had conquered. And they would either take that back to Rome in order to keep the Romans happy, because he said all it is just a constant question of keeping the people from rebelling against you. He said it's a constant fight to not only keep your people in the Roman Empire in Rome happy, and therefore keep all the senators and all the people in power happy, but also the people in the conquered lands were constantly creating rebellions. And there were all sorts of what you might call terrorist factions who were anti-Roman, who were trying to make the most of that moment in order to get rid of the Romans and have their country back. And he said that you'll be very interested if I just mention to you the story of your Jesus Christ, where this was definitely the situation that was happening around Jerusalem at the point of the Christ story. There were also tremendous deprivations heaped upon the Jewish people and the people in the areas around Jerusalem. There were ruthless Roman generals and people in charge. They had only one thing in mind, was to make as much money as possible in order to send it back to Rome or to build glory for themselves, to make them rise in power, make them look good to the Caesar. But it was at the cost of everyone else who was living in that area, who had a terrible time. And obviously the Christ story came about as a form of rebellion that was taking place, with the Christ figure being just one of many resistance groups that were trying to get rid of the Roman Empire and to stop this stealing of everything that was theirs. The money that they had to give. He said that they had to give not only taxes, but they had to give all sorts of donations and bribes and fees to various people. There were taxes everywhere, and it just made life intolerable for the people. He's saying the Romans only managed to do what they did through the fear and terror of their armies and almost the psychopathic retribution that they would inflict on anyone who resisted them. But as soon as that power diminished and enough people were unhappy, that was really the beginning of the end for the Roman Empire. Well, you certainly don't seem to have anything terribly nice to say about the Roman Empire. Was it really all bad? Was it? There must have been some good things about the Roman Empire in Germany. He said, yes, historically, there were some good things about the Roman Empire. He said, you can joke and you can say, what did the Romans do for you? But, the Romans did a lot. They did build things. They built aqueducts and they built roads. They had a very high level and sophistication of engineering. They planned things very well. They brought in laws and codified things. They had a sense of appreciation for the arts and for literature. They were a very advanced civilization, which is why they were so successful. But that doesn't diminish from the fact that the enjoyable aspects were really very, very small compared to the terrible day-to-day existence of most people. If you were a senator or if you were a very senior person in the authorities, and you had slaves and you had a big house, you could have a wonderful life. But again, that was a very tiny proportion of the people who were living in Cologne. Okay, well, thank you very much for coming in and talking to me. Titan, is there anybody else from the Roman times who would like to speak to me? Titan is saying, no, not really. It's a general comment that he would make from his knowledge of life as it existed those thousands of years ago. Yes, it was an extremely difficult time in human history. There were a lot of very simple people, thousands and thousands, she says, of very simple people who lived very simple lives, who basically lived on a form of bread and water. Some of them had housing, and others of them did not. They slept in makeshift housing or in the streets. And of course it was extremely hard, particularly in the northern territories, particularly in places like Cologne, where it would be only lovely weather for a few months a year, and at other times it would be very, very cold. And one of the stories that she said that has come to her, which she'll pass through to me, is that in Cologne there was a big marketplace, and in that marketplace there was a tremendous amount of buying and selling of all sorts of things. And one of the most important things that people could have living in a climate like this was animal skins, and in order to stay warm. And there was a terrible point where in the middle of a very cold winter, the Roman authorities went and confiscated, first of all through high taxation, making it unavailable for most people to afford them, but also eventually by taking them, taking all these animal skins, and had them all taken back to Rome in order to provide the people there with these animal skins. This caused the death of hundreds of people through cold and misery in this particular winter. And she's telling me this, she says, just to give you another example of this cruel humanity that existed, but people were almost worthless. There was just so little appreciation of anybody's feelings or their rights as human beings. Only if you were in the higher echelons of society did it really matter, and did you have any say in the way things were. And in that respect, it was probably wonderful in the end that the Roman Empire did go, and that people started taking back their lives. But it would still take hundreds of years for this to all change. And Titan says that you must appreciate that your life now is just so charmed in the 21st century compared to all the centuries before, where the availability of food and warmth and clothing was so limited. But now everyone takes it for granted. And by the standards of the people who've lived before you, your ancestors, you're living in probably the best times that you could ever live. Lastly, she says that it is important to be fair to history. And although conquering Rome was pretty terrible for a lot of people, and to be living in a place like Cologne or France or any of these other countries that were completely taken over by the Romans, life was truly awful, because they didn't necessarily gain citizenship rights unless they paid a lot of money or had to do various things over a period of time. And there were an awful lot of slaves. A lot of the people in the conquered lands were automatically made slaves, and they were either sent into the army or sent back to Rome, or sent to places where the wealthy citizens of Rome could exploit them. And they were not even, she said, considered to be human. They had no rights at all. They could be executed, they could be beaten, they could be raped. And there was no law to protect them. It was considered completely normal. And she's saying, again, you have to see things in perspective. This is the way the society founded itself. But in return for all of this, there was a tremendous amount of achievement in the Roman times. There was a tremendous technological development that, when the Romans left, took hundreds of years for things to return to that level. So a lot was lost when the Roman Empire was finished, because with it went a lot of know-how and knowledge and technological achievement. But yes, at what cost? does technological achievement come. Usually, the slavery and the impoverishment of millions of people. And Titan is saying maybe that is the lesson that we should end with today, and the lesson of what happens in societies that end up becoming so big and so unmanageable that ultimately they end up serving the richest and the most powerful, and it's the poor people and the poorer in society that end up being the most disadvantaged, the ones that are abused. And this, sadly, often seems to be the course of human history. But in the case of the Roman Empire, this kept going for hundreds of years because there was an extremely elaborate and well thought out way to gain the support of the people who were conquered as well as the citizens of Rome and the other countries. And that was because they were providing them with things that kept them alive, such as food and clothing and security. And as long as that was happening, people felt that the government was worth having. But as soon as the government was not providing that, then the citizens started to taking matters into their own hands. And that is when society started fracturing and the government started to fall, and the people, almost through panic, started taking things into their own hands. And Titan is saying, I would want to say to the people who are listening, this is exactly what's happening now in most Western democracies. It's happening that people are largely becoming untrustworthy of the people who govern them, and they feel that there is such inequality between them and the people who rule them or own everything, and it's causing this sense of revolution. Titan says to me that there isn't this sense you're going to have a revolution soon, but the anger is causing already protests, and certainly in different countries of the world it's causing wars and discontent. And ultimately, all that happens in these particular circumstances where you have the great against the small is that thousands and thousands of people die needlessly. And if only we as humans could try to call a time out. And she's saying, see a way that this endless spiral that has existed through thousands of years of human history could once and for all be stopped. Well, thank you, Titan. Maybe that's something for another episode. Maybe it would be wonderful if we could start talking about the potential for humans in this world, rather than how we seem to be endlessly repeating the mistakes of the past. But thank you very much for listening, and thank you, Titan, and we'll see you next week.